And we are live.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this virtual conversation on how Maryland treats our children. We will be looking at the 2020 State Ratings Report, and we will have a presentation by James Dole from Human Rights Campaign for Kids. I want to start off by thanking all of our strategic partners in this space and thanking all of our members of the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition, as well as the People's Commission. And James, I'm turning it right over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for putting all of this together and for all of the panelists for joining us for this very important conversation. Today is a very important day. Folks may or may not be aware that it's World's Children's Day or Children's Rights Day. And this day was designated as such for a very particular purpose. On this day in 1959, the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration of Rights of the Child. And then in 1989, the General Assembly adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on. But these documents were very important in establishing the basic framework for international human rights protections that are meant to be in place to protect children so that they can reach their full potential and become contributing members of their society. And so we're really excited to be joining this conversation today and to hear from all of our panelists about what Maryland needs to be doing to better protect the human rights of children in the justice system. And so as we get started, I'm going to go ahead and ask Hannah to pull up the PowerPoint presentation so we can ground this conversation in an overview of our recently released report on human rights protections for kids in the justice system. Okay, we don't need to see my ugly mug. We can go to the next slide. All right, just quick background about Human Rights for Kids. We're a nonprofit dedicated to the promotion and protection of the human rights of children. We advocate for the most vulnerable children in our society through public education, research, strategic litigation, policy advocacy, and grassroots organizing. Our story, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I'll just get through this real quickly. I love telling this little joke. A West Virginia Republican, an Arkansas Democrat, and a human rights lawyer walk into a bar. I include this because it's sort of emblematic of how we got started as an organization. Today, we have 11 current or former state legislators from all over the country, both Republicans and Democrats, who have come together to advocate for better human rights protections for kids in the justice system, as well as in child welfare and education. And one of the things that unites us all is this desire to better improve outcomes for children across America. We can go to the next slide. We see things a little bit differently. We use a trauma-informed human rights lens. And one of the reasons that this is so important, especially for the conversation today, is that most of the children who come into contact with the criminal justice system are contending with severe amounts of adverse childhood experiences and early childhood trauma, which is oftentimes a driver for why these kids become justice involved in the first place. And so it really helps to inform the conversation around what policies need to be in place to focus on the treatment and rehabilitation of young people, especially deep-end kids when they commit some of the more serious offenses, and addressing our societal failures to protect them from harm in the first place. Next slide. And then the second part of this equation is really looking at human rights standards and how children are protected around the globe. These are universally recognized. Starting with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think it's important to note that while this document is now over 30 years old, and every nation state has both signed and ratified this treaty, the United States is the only country, I repeat, the only country that has not ratified it, which is one of the reasons why we see the proliferation of these human rights abuses against children in the U.S. criminal justice system. I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but there's a number of articles that specifically spell out certain legal protections that should be in place for children, one of which is the prohibition against the imposition of cruel or degrading or inhumane treatment, such as solitary confinement. Another is the prohibition on the death sentence and the use of life without parole sentences for children. And this overarching theme that we need to treat children differently than we treat adults when they commit crimes, even the most serious crimes. And similarly, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, again, spells out how children need to be treated differently. And this is a covenant that we are a party to, and that international human rights bodies have found that we're in violation of. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights a couple of years ago released a scathing report, really taking the United States to task for our treatment of children in the U.S. justice system. One of the things that the Commission observed was that the ambiguity of the reservation that we made in the ICCPR, specifically that we would limit our treatment of children in the adult system to unique or special or exceptional circumstances, wasn't in fact the case, and that the ambiguity of that reservation that we made had resulted in the violation of children's human rights at the federal, state, and local levels. And we'll get into a little bit for why this is in our report in just a second. Next slide, please. So our report in general, we released this report to really establish a national benchmark to educate the public policymakers, the philanthropic sector, the advocacy community, policymakers, everyone who had a vested interest in the outcomes of our youth, so that folks understood how we were failing to protect our most vulnerable children and how we were in violation of many of these human rights standards. So our report examines 12 categories of law that we've deemed essential to establishing a basic legal framework to protect the human rights of kids in the justice system. These categories are largely informed by both the CRC and the ICCPR, and they cover four main categories, really. Children's entrance into the criminal and juvenile justice systems, the treatment of children as adults, conditions of confinement, and then finally, the social reintegration of child offenders once they've completed their sentences. So basically what we did was we reviewed the statutes in each of the states for each of these 12 categories, and then states received a composite score based on the cumulative total that they received. And then based on that, we then ranked states according to how well they did based on our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4, which I'll talk about in just a second. Go to the next slide, please. Just keeping track of time. So these 12 categories that you see on your screen here are the ones that we deemed essential because they were directly informed and we could directly link back to the CRC as well as the ICCPR. And again, if you look to the far left-hand side of your screen, this is really that first bucket of categories that I mentioned of children's entrance into the justice system. So it's looking at what happens at the point when children are arrested. Are there due process protections in place? The minimum age by which we allow children to even be adjudicated delinquent in the juvenile justice system to begin with, whether or not states extend juvenile court jurisdiction to all children under the age of 18, and then the treatment of children in the adult criminal justice system. And here we wanted to make it clear that we needed to draw age-based distinctions and categorically prohibit, no matter what offense a child commits, prohibit the transfer of children under the age of 14 into the adult system, and then also require, even if a child is going to be subject to transfer, that they not be transferred, and they have a hearing if they're between the ages of 14 and 17 that considers their child status as well as their exposure to adverse childhood experiences and traumatic events earlier in their life. The middle category really focuses on the treatment of children if they've been subject to transfer and are being tried in the adult system. And here we wanted states to end the application of mandatory minimum sentences, create new standards by which children are sentenced that are different from the ways that adults are sentenced, ending the felony murder rule, banning the use of life without parole sentences, and banning the use of virtual life or de facto life without sentences, and really having a safety valve for release so that children, after a certain amount of time, would automatically come up and be eligible for release from incarceration. Then on the right-hand column, the first two categories, banning solitary confinement and banning the incarceration of children in adult jails, lockups, or prisons, fits into that the third bucket there, which is the conditions of confinement. And then the last two, post-release supervision and voting rights restoration, really focuses in on children's social reintegration, wanting to make sure that they don't have the stigma of being on lifetime parole or lengthy post-release supervision, and that they can become full contributing members of society by being able to exercise their rights as citizens to vote. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we have these tiers based on the number of points that a state received. We place them in those particular tiers. And here, tier 1 is being the best. We only had one state in that category that I'll mention in just a second. But here, states have an impressive legal framework to protect the human rights of children, and they are taking their obligation to defend human rights seriously. On the other end of the spectrum, which is where Maryland fell, we have our tier 4 states, right? And this is where states have made little to no effort to protect the human rights of children in the justice system and is likely in violation of international human rights standards. Next slide, please. So based on everything that I just mentioned, you can see from the color-coded map here, basically blue being the best, which is also the reason we chose blue, I should also mention, is because it's also recognized as the color for the human rights logo. There's a logo that recognizes human rights. It's actually a hand that's meant to also sort of be a dove. It's like one of those, I guess, dual messages when you look at it. But it was recently adopted as the human rights logo so that people would recognize it, and it's blue along with the UN colors. So that's why we chose blue. And as you can see, California is the only state that met that criteria. But on this map, we also wanted to highlight sort of the 3 best performing states to really show that this was not a partisan issue, that, you know, even though California had the highest cumulative score, there were other conservative states that were right there along with it. And so North Dakota and Arkansas, people are always shocked when I tell them this, North Dakota and Arkansas were also among the best human rights protectors when it comes to kids in the justice system, earning 8 points and 7.5 points respectively. The other end of the spectrum, we have what we termed the worst human rights offenders. And these were Alabama, Georgia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wyoming, all of which only received 2 points in our state ratings report. Next slide, please. And I've gone through a couple of these, but you know, I wanted to just highlight Maryland real quickly. Maryland only received credit in our state ratings report for extending juvenile court jurisdictions to kids under 18 and for voting rights restoration for formerly incarcerated youth. As you'll see from the maps that we're going to show real quick, these two were really kind of gimme categories where almost every single state receives credit for both of them. And so, you know, right off the bat, most states, you know, started off with at least 2 points. And so, you know, the fact that Maryland did not score better is really a damning indictment of the laws that are currently in place that allow children to have their human rights violated on a regular and ongoing basis in Maryland. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this is sort of the map that highlights how many states have received credit for the maximum court age for all kids under the age of 18. There's only 3 states that didn't receive credit for this category, those being Wisconsin, Georgia, and Texas. And you see these themes beginning to emerge as you see stories coming out from these different states on how children are regularly treated and how their human rights are violated on a pretty consistent basis. Next slide, please. Again, voting rights, again, as I mentioned, the category where most states received credit. Here we were just looking for states to allow formerly incarcerated youth to have their voting rights restored after they've been released from incarceration after a reasonable point in time. And so, you know, again, this was another one of those gimme categories. Next slide, please. There's a couple of these that I just wanted to flag before we transition into our panel discussion, because I think they're really important. One is minimum court age. In Maryland, the minimum court age is 7. You know, we wanted to set 10 as a minimum standard because that's really where, you know, kids begin to be more able to form what we call the mens rea requirement, where being treated in the juvenile justice system becomes more appropriate. Although one of the things that we are pushing states to do is actually set that age even higher at the age of at least 12. There was one state that's done that, and that's the state of the Commonwealth, I should say, of Massachusetts. And that's really what we encourage states to do. California also sets the age at 12, except in the cases of murder. And so, you know, when states had these exceptions in place, they did not receive credit because we do not want states saying, yeah, we don't believe that, you know, a child can form the requisite intent and be held criminally culpable, except if they commit so-and-so offense, right? It doesn't work like that. If we believe that children cannot form the requisite mens rea requirement, it doesn't matter what they do. We need to treat them as children. And this is a category where Maryland, like many other states, is failing in that regard. I'll call attention real quick to the bottom of your screen. People are always shocked when I tell them that Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi have these protections in place for children. So certainly if Mississippi and Louisiana can do this, Maryland can do this too. Next slide, please. Adult courts. This is another really important provision to get more kids out of the adult criminal justice system. Again, prohibiting kids under the age of 14 from being subject to prosecution in adult court at all. I should note that, we realize that, there is an effort to try to get all kids out of the adult criminal justice system. And so this shouldn't be construed in any way as sort of a model provision for us that we want, if you allow kids who are 14 to be prosecuted as adults, you're doing a good job. The way that this report and these categories really should be construed as a bare minimum standard of care, right? And so that's, also where Maryland is falling down again. And I'll call your attention down to the bottom states again: Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, all prohibit kids under the age of 14 from being prosecuted in adult court, no matter what they do. And so again, if this is something that Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana can do, certainly Maryland should be able to do it as well. Kansas is the only state that received full credit for this category, as they both prohibit the transfer of children under the age of 14 and require a child status hearing for children between the ages of 14 and 17, with no exceptions before a child can be proceeded against in adult court. Next slide, please. Mandatory minimums. Most states did not receive credit for this, but this is something that we're really trying to get more and more states to embrace. This last year, Virginia was one of the few states that enacted similar reforms. This, again, is going to allow states to come into compliance with the need to treat children differently in the justice system. Next slide, please. And again, Maryland is one of the few states now in the region that still allows life without parole sentences to be imposed. It's one of only 5 states that has not come into compliance with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, which I think Crystal, one of our panelists, is going to talk a little bit about later on. But we just wanted to show this map so that folks could see again that this is a bipartisan issue that states are moving away from rather quickly. Next slide, please. And then again, solitary confinement, many states are having full out bans. In order to receive full credit, 2 things needed to happen. There needed to be a ban on solitary confinement for kids in juvenile facilities, which, the lighter shade blue states had, but then also a prohibition on solitary confinement for kids in adult facilities, which oftentimes happens to kids because, they're placed in those conditions for what people term their own protection. So we have a lot of kids that are currently incarcerated in adult prisons where they're placed in these inhumane and degrading facilities or treatment. Next slide, please. And then, one way to get credit for banning solitary confinement for kids in adult prisons is simply not to place kids in adult prisons to begin with. And unfortunately, there were only 3 states that received credit for this. Again, California just enacted a law this year banning the incarceration of children in these facilities. West Virginia, people always want to make fun of West Virginia, but I'll tell you what, it's one of the best states in the country when it comes to protecting the human rights of kids in the justice system. And then again, Rhode Island is the other state that received credit in this category. Next slide, please. What does it all mean? Looking sort of big picture, what we see is a collection of red and blue states, conservatives and liberals, both leading on these issues, as well as both failing. And that's important because what it tells us is that we can win. We can win on these issues. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to close out. We love, at Human Rights for Kids, we love this quote from the great Nelson Mandela. He said that there can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And so on Children's Rights Day, we hope that folks will resolve to join us in moving the country in a better direction to protect the human rights of children. And so with that, I am going to close out my brief presentation and now invite our panelists to join us. So folks, if we can put all the panels back up on the screen, and I'll ask people to remain muted unless you're speaking, and we can just go in the order that that I see folks. So I'll ask my questions accordingly, and then I have a number of questions. I don't know if we'll get to them all, but we also will save time for folks from the audience to also weigh in as well. And I want to make sure that I'm yeah, that I'm staying on time as well. So my first question, and Nikita, you're the first person I'm seeing, so I'm going to start with you. Can each of you just take a quick moment to introduce yourselves and tell us and our audience what brought you to this work?
Well, my name is Nikita Mason. I am a member of the People's Commission. I have been involved in multiple systems since I was a young person. I grew up in the foster care system. I've been in youth incarceration, which led to some adult incarceration. I've been involved in multiple systems throughout my life, and I've also been involved in multiple nonprofits. I started my nonprofit career doing youth media, teaching other young people how to create social justice videos where youth perspective can inspire change. And then from there, I've branched off into other aspects of social entrepreneurship, doing work with the NEKC Foundation, and basically kind of guiding them on youth engagement. And this work is near and dear to me because I have a young son. I have siblings that are currently in the foster care system. I have family members who are incarcerated right now, young men in my family who have been involved in activities that have led them into the juvenile justice system, and they have also been charged as adults for their crimes. And I got the opportunity to be a part of the People's Commission, and it is my mission to make a dent and make a change in those type of interactions that youth have um, with the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much, Nikita. And I feel the emotion coming from your voice. And I just want to thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing that part of your life and story, and for the advocacy work that you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nate, I see you next. I'm going to go ahead and pivot to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad I can be a part of this today because this report, I know we're going to get to that question, but this report hit me hard. And I work at the Annie Casey Foundation, where I am the director of our Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. I grew up in Maryland, in Montgomery County. I came to this work in some ways a little bit by accident. I was working, always interested in youth issues and interested in justice issues. I started working for Washington, D.C.'s municipal government, the district's government, and worked in their juvenile justice agency. And that exposed me to all the ways in which what we call juvenile justice is a series of injustices in which behavior for many young people that is normal adolescent behavior that gets kind of treated the way that we might expect by understanding that kids are kids and that they do things that may cross the line into things that are illegal, but it doesn't make them bad kids, and it certainly shouldn't harm them for the rest of their lives. And for other kids, we feel totally okay with disrupting their childhoods, sending them, putting them on probation with a bunch of conditions, locking them up in detention centers and correctional facilities. And once I was exposed to that, something that I knew nothing about myself growing up in Maryland as a teenager in Maryland, seeing it as an adult, I got the bug. Once I got that, I couldn't stop wanting to work on this. And I learned about the Annie Casey Foundation through doing that work. And it's become my life's passion to change this system and all of it that it does to young people.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Nate, and for all the work that you and the Annie Casey Foundation do. And next, I see Garrett. I'm going to go ahead and pivot to you. Quick aside, I'm really glad that you were able to join us, Garrett. We've never met, but this is my 10-year anniversary of officially becoming a Catholic. I was baptized at Loyola in Baltimore during my 3rd year in law school, so I'm really glad that the Catholic Conference can join us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Very nice. Happy anniversary, James. Thank you. And I really want to thank you for the great report and the work that you do. It's very eye-opening and just an awesome report. So as far as, why we're here in this space, the Maryland Catholic Conference has been a longstanding proponent of justice reform, both in the adult and the youth justice systems in Maryland and across the U.S. through our national conference. Me personally, I came through my past law practice. I had experience on both sides of the justice system and became interested in the prospects for reform here in Maryland when I moved here. And when I began working for the church, I was very encouraged at the breadth of advocacy for justice reform that the church is engaged in, which I hadn't realized the extent of prior to. But really, what is at the core of why we're in this space is we believe that rehabilitation is really at the core of the justice system. So that does not mean that we have to neglect addressing wrong, but it means really that we need to foster second chances, and that's what we believe. So it's a really important consideration in the adult justice system, but even more of a consideration we believe in the youth justice system. So the recognition that youth in fact have inherent characteristics of even greater prospects for reform due to the fact that they're scientifically not fully formed in conscience is really of the utmost importance. And that's why we're in this space advocating for reform policies.
Great, thank you so much, Garrett. And now my good friend from the R Street, you're the next person on my screen. Emily, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I'm Emily Mooney from the R Street Institute, and for folks who aren't familiar, we're a policy think tank based in DC that works to advance free markets and limited effective government. So I'll save my spiel about how this issue is really grounded in government overreach and lack of evaluation for a later point in this conversation. But personally, I was brought into this work really also similar to Nate and focused on youth issues, and then realized in just some of my outreach and volunteering in the community that those youth issues were so intertwined with criminal justice involvement, both with family members, the normalization of violence in communities, and just young people used to, seeing people they loved move away or be affected by violence, or that seeing a murder happen in your neighborhood was commonplace and to be accepted and dealt with. And likewise, hearing just stories of victimization and how that often connected to crime and future criminal justice involvement. And was since joining R Street and working on issues over the last, I guess, 4 or so years, a member of my family member was charged in the adult system due to the maximum court jurisdiction. And so certainly this is both professionally, personally, and my own political views is something that I'm glad you highlighted, that some Republicans in some states have stepped up, but it's truly a bipartisan issue. It's an issue about families, about people, and and then depending on one's spiritual conviction as well, an issue about morality and justice and believing in redemption. So excited for this conversation today. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Emily. And then last but certainly not least, our good friend from the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, Crystal. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what brought you to the work.
Thanks, James. My name is Crystal Carpenter. I work for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. It's a nonprofit that leads efforts to ban life without parole and other extreme sentences for children who cause harm. It advances alternative responses that focus on their unique characteristics as children, including their capacity for change and creating opportunities for those that are formerly incarcerated or formerly incarcerated youth to thrive as adults and lead in their communities. So I've been at the campaign for about 2 years. I've been focused on criminal justice reform or reform to the criminal legal system for the past 24 years. I was thrust into that position when my loved one was facing time, 57 years to life for a crime that was committed at the age of 17. So through that journey and fighting for his release, I came across the campaign, was able to do advocacy work and play an integral role in getting legislation passed in Washington, D.C. So I am now bringing that full circle focusing on making sure the proper supports are there for others that are coming home, and also just trying to make sure that we're able to get as many states across the nation as possible to follow the practices that James alluded to earlier in his presentation and make sure that children have age-appropriate sentences.
Great. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're really excited for this conversation. And now I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to start with a couple of questions before I ask you individually specific questions about your work. But my first question for everyone is, we did this overview of the report. Was there anything that jumped out to folks? Was there anything that shocked you about Maryland's rating in our state ratings report? Did you sort of have this in the back of your mind that, Maryland doesn't do a great job anyways? Or were folks shocked just to learn just how poorly Maryland was treating kids in the justice system when it comes to the legal protections that are in place to protect their human rights? And anybody, I'm going to just open it up, anybody can respond to that.
Can I respond? So I wasn't surprised. But I guess I had more hope for our ratings. I have friends who actually work for the Baltimore City Juvenile Detention Center downtown, and we have conversations often about the fact that there's hearings for individuals to be waived down and to stay in the juvenile court, and it seems like it's happening more often when I'm having those conversations, but it was just I was kind of hopeful from having the dealings with my friends that work there, and then when I got this report, I'm like, yeah, well. It was kind of a surprise, but I was more hopeful, so my hopes were shot down.
Other folks have thoughts they want to share? Thank you, Nikita.
I think for me,
I'm happy to chime in. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think for me, years ago, as I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area and in Maryland, and you often think of, you don't realize how much of a difference it is between Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, right? Because everything is kind of lumped together as the DMV. But in theory, when you're growing up, you think about D.C. as being like very liberal. You think about Virginia as being like this very conservative place. And then Maryland, you think it's like somewhere in the middle, but I didn't realize how much in the middle it was until I got into this space and started seeing. And this was years ago when I first learned about the like you said, West Virginia, right? And all the protections they had in place for a child. And then looking at Maryland, my expectations were so much higher for them. So I realized, I think what shocked me so much about the report in general, something I've been learning over the past few years, it's just that one of the biggest misconceptions that I think I always hear about criminal reforms to the criminal legal system is that it's a partisan issue, and people think that if you're like overly if one party is in power more so than the other, then it's more likely to have these protections in place when it pertains to criminal justice reform. So it was shocking to that, because you see that, especially when you're in Prince George's County or Baltimore City and these more liberal places, and then you realize that the numbers are higher there, it has least, the protections are less in the state overall. I think that was the biggest, the thing that I was just like, wow, that's something I wasn't expecting.
So I was going to say two things in terms of my reaction, sort of one as a professional in this world and one as a resident of the state, and someone who spent most of my life in Maryland. So I'll start with the reaction as someone working in this space. I think what was really, I don't know if I was surprised or shocked, maybe a little, but I think that in my world, so much of the time is focused on the practices of the juvenile justice system. What is it that police officers are doing at the street level? What is it that intake officers within a juvenile justice agency are doing when they're working with young people? What are prosecutors doing? what's happening in facilities, what are probation officers doing, what are the services that are available, what is the data that they're looking at, like all of these things that get at the ability of both the community to change how we respond in juvenile justice and the system to change how we respond. And that's where most of my attention, frankly, has been. And when I read this report, I think what was so jarring was the idea that all of that stuff could be happening. And a state like Maryland could be making progress on many fronts. And it doesn't change the fact that our legal framework is broken and embarrassing. And I think that is, that's my biggest takeaway from this, is that there are things that are up to the policymakers to handle. And this should be a wake-up call in a big way, because no matter what we're doing in reducing incarceration or detention, no matter what we're doing in changing probation practices, no matter what we're doing in expanding services, having restorative justice, whatever that thing might be, it doesn't change this. And so from Roll, that was my reaction. As a citizen of Maryland, as someone who pays taxes in Maryland, who grew up in Maryland, again, I go back to the idea that this was a state that I feel like helped me grow into someone who could have a career, who could do things, who protected me in ways, who allowed me to have school, who allowed me to have freedom, who allowed me to have access to services. And I think that there's something that should be jarring to all of us who live here, that this is just not even close to good enough. I like the way that you framed it, James. This is the bare minimum. We're not saying that by getting points in this report that means you deserve some great pat on the back. That's just saying that you're doing something. And I have nothing against the other states that are in the bottom of this. So it's not to me this like a blue state, red state thing. But we should take note, as a state that sees itself as being progressive, that says it stands for certain values, we are not living up to the values that we see when it comes to the legal rights of children. And I think as someone who just, as a resident of this state, I doubt my neighbors, I doubt my former neighbors, no matter where I've lived in the state, would believe that we are that low when it comes to this.
Thank you, Nate. Very well said. Garrett?
I would say, in building upon what Nate said, I expected not to be shocked, because I thought I knew of our state as having made more progress in this area. I expected the general public to be shocked, but I did not expect to be shocked, but I was. I'm just going to note a specific example. You know, with there are things we fixed here in Maryland, or so I thought, that I now realize we haven't fixed completely after reading the report. Youth housed in adult jails is something that we worked on and very much supported a few years ago. And we did make some really great inroads in that aspect, and DJS and their handling of it should be, you know, acknowledged for that. But I realized that our policy didn't get full credit with the report because of the shortcomings when compared to other states. And I think that's really important to note.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that, you know, and that was one of the things that we were really trying to get at was, you know, there needs to be, as Garrett, as you alluded to, and Nate mentioned, this bare minimum standard of care. And when we have kids, and this has happened in Maryland, it's happened this year, we have kids who are detained in adult jail, in an adult cell with a grown adult. Right? Not only is that a violation of basic human rights standards, but it's also a violation of federal law. And so this is something that is happening on a regular basis in Maryland that, you know, I think the report is beginning to draw out. And so I really appreciate everyone's comments. And I'm going to transition a little bit. I've got more questions I'll come back to if we don't have questions from the audience, but I really want to give each of you a chance to answer targeted questions that we developed specifically about your work. And so my first question is going to go to both Nikita and Crystal. Can you both, you know, you both talked earlier about just the impact from a human standpoint that these issues have had directly on you, your families, the communities that you live in there in Maryland. And I was hoping that you guys might just take a moment to talk a little bit about the human impact a little bit more, what it means for young people and their families when they face the prospects of potential lengthy prison sentences. And can you also in responding to that, also talk about the backgrounds of a lot of these youth and what they're contending with and why they enter the justice system to begin with from a societal failure standpoint, and what we need to be doing to prevent that from happening in the first place. I know I threw a lot at you guys, but I think you both are the best positioned on this call to really talk about this from what's happening on the ground in these communities. Go ahead, Nikita.
So I'll go first. I think that I don't my okay, I'll open this up. I don't come from money. My family, we struggle. We come from struggle. A lot of us are welfare, recipients, and we need assistance. And for example, my two cousins who are, and when you mentioned earlier, I just have to go back to the fact that, young people are in cells with adults. Like my little cousin, he was into some activities to help his family make money, and he got, in trouble. And right now, he is in a cell with a grown man who will not allow him to do anything. And it's a struggle for me, coming from, the foster care system, and being incarcerated as a young person, and not having the connections, or the even the know-how to get him the help that he needs. I'm at a disadvantage, and all I can do is listen to him. I can't help him. I can't do anything for him, and that mentally, it tears you down, because he's a child, and his mother was trying to get help with his behavior through different avenues, and she even came to me to see if I can get him into the program that I was working with the youth media, and I tried, but it was difficult. I think that I just wanted to share that fact that, mentally I'm struggling with the fact that I cannot help him in his situation. He's there, and I'm out here, and I don't have the resources to give him what he needs, and I can't even talk to the individual whom he's incarcerated with, to even try to build a relationship, to help them build a relationship, because they're in a cell together. They have to live together. They have to coexist. And so, from the standpoint of human rights and society, and where he comes from, and where young people who are in these situations come from, it all, to me, goes back to the fact that there's not enough resources and opportunities in urban neighborhoods, in urban communities, for young people to see another way to help their families, basically have the live to live in comfortably. He most of my family, we were on Section 8. Young people, our children, we have to go to for Christmas and holidays, stop the Salvation Army, and young people want to help when they see their family struggling. And if the only opportunities they see is other individuals giving them packs to sell, or telling them to come to do such and such, is quick money, it can help you, help this and that with your family, they're going to do it. It's an opportunity. But if they have other opportunities, they will do those as well. But if you don't see those, if they're not prevalent in your neighborhood, and the prevalence is the other option, I mean, it's a human emotion, or a human, everybody wants to take care of themselves. And that is what, especially in the situation that I'm talking about with my cousins who are now incarcerated, that's what they were trying to do. And I think having opportunities like with the NEKC Foundation, they have the Learn and Earn to Achieve Potential opportunity for young people who have been disconnected from school and work to come and learn a trade, or go to school, or do both. And they have opportunities to work with different nonprofits around Baltimore and get engaged in different ways to make money, in different ways to earn and learn and help your family, thrive. And I think that that's a very important aspect to think about when young people are being sentenced, or even from the get-go, when an officer is interacting with a young person, he needs to have those things in mind when dealing with a young person, so you can have that knowledge to build the relationship, so that you understand where the young person is coming from, so that when you go into the courtroom to make, when officers have to come into the courtroom to testify, that they're able to speak for that young person and where they were coming from, because that it's unfortunate, but that officer's point of view is going to be taken to a higher standard than the child's background and where they came from. So having that officer able to speak from the child's point of view and where they came from, I think is integral, is very important from the beginning of the child's interaction with the criminal justice system, which starts with the police. I have more to say, but I want to give.
Thank you, Nikita. No, absolutely. You raised so many important points, and I'm going to wrap that up after we hear from Crystal.
Yeah, and I'll go quickly. I think Nikita really summarized everything pretty well. James, to your point, I think we see and we know, and just from living in these communities, that over 90% of these cases, individuals serving these extreme sentences have some type of trauma involved during their childhood, right? And that's from even broken families. They come from broken families, or riddled with drug abuse, sexual abuse, homelessness, and other extreme forms of poverty. So those things are not uncommon in these cases. So in many ways, what I've seen and what I've known to be true, just from my life and the friendships and relationships that I've had with individuals, that the systems around us have failed them, or seemingly failed them over and over again, like time and time again, from the school systems they were in, not catching when their grades are dropping, and they have all these things that are prevalent, that are clear indicators that something is wrong. No one says anything, and then they go into the streets and they try to find a way of life, and people know that they're not going to school, or that they have some type of, when they not going to the doctor, or not all these things, and no one does anything there. And then when they go in the criminal justice system, it's like, okay, I want to lock them up for the rest of their life, right? When you failed them previous, you never gave them an opportunity to thrive. So to Nikita's point, there's definitely a deficit in access to opportunity in the communities that many of these individuals come from. I will say, as it pertains to when families and individuals are faced with these lengthy sentences, I think it makes a major difference when you don't have a sense of hope on the other side. It makes a difference in the way in which you do your time, is what I've seen in people. So if you go to court and you're 15 or 16 years old and you're told that you're going to die in prison, right? It changes the way, it may impact the trajectory you go on when you first go into prison, because you think you're going to die. So you're kind of giving up throughout your time. So you spend your time differently. I think what I've seen and what I've noted is that at the same time, despite over 90% of these cases having, faced with difficulties before they got incarcerated, the individuals that I've met and know personally are some of the most resilient people that I've ever encountered, right? And that means that, you know, they've taken a lot of classes, done a lot of things to change their life around, despite not having opportunities or access to opportunity before they came home, and even sometimes being barred from doing certain classes while they're in prison. But I do think that what we've seen, even with the DC cases or the cases in DC that fell under the law, that it literally, once the law went into effect, it changed the trajectory of the prison system. The way in which people were doing their time, people started doing their time with a new sense of hope. It ended in a lot of the prisons, and this is documented, a lot of the prison system, less fights, less things, because they was just doing their time differently. They had hope. Like, the hope changed things within the prison systems, and people don't realize how much what that means, but it really means a lot. It made people have to think about what they're doing. They didn't think that they were going to die in prison. So I do think for families, it makes a difference too. Being a family member of someone that was incarcerated for a lengthy period of time, you do that time day to day with them, right? And it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And it's hard to have conversations with people on the other side, and you trying to be hopeful in a situation where you don't see any type of light. So it's really hard on families. It's really hard on those that are incarcerated. It's harder on those that are incarcerated, but it's definitely hard on families and those that are incarcerated when there's no hope attached, when they're facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, and especially when they get a lengthy prison sentence attached to them.
Can I just add a couple of things? I want to be vulnerable in this space and share that, you know, two things: having a young son who may, you know, one day, coming from my background, knowing that he's one of the children who are in danger of, you know, because of my background and you know, his family, he has no control over the fact that he was born through me, and now due to that, he is susceptible to all of these dangers of becoming an incarcerated youth. I struggle with housing and homelessness. I've struggled with it previously with my mom through, you know, and all of these things. And I know that as he grows up, he lives with me. He's a part of my family. He's gonna see me struggling as a young Black mother in Baltimore, and he's gonna want to, you know, help me. And he could make questionable decisions because he is an adolescent. He's going to be growing and learning. And to think that someone would look at him and say, you know, oh no, you made this one mistake. You know, any of us can make one decision, and it could change the course of our lives forever. It could end our lives. So to think that an adult would, you know, put my son in handcuffs instead of trying to negate his path is frightening for me as a Black woman and as a mother, and I don't know how to deal with that trauma or how to prepare my child, and I'm learning how to do that as I go. Another thing I want to say is that when families are reaching out for help, for example, I have two siblings. My mother is a addict. She has been for all my life. And I have an 8-year-old sister and a 2-year-old sister. And they are now struggling with the fact that they are not getting their needs met. And I keep reaching out to social workers. I reach out to their teachers. Their teachers are reaching out to me, asking me why they're not in school. And I'm telling them, you know, here's the social worker's number. Can you help me get them support and different things? And all I get is that if we get involved, they're going to take your siblings away. And you won't have any contact with them because you don't have any control over where they're placed in the foster care system. And if your mother doesn't give her rights over, you can't even take care of them. And you won't get any assistance if you take care of them, because that's kinship care and you don't get help with kinship care. And to think that my siblings have no way out. So they have a social worker. The social worker sees that they have food, and that's enough for them. You know, there's been situations where I've had to speed to a Burger King because my mother has went out from drugs she's done, and my little sisters are rolled up in the car, suffocated. And I called the police to there, and their only thing is, we woke her up and she's fine now. They can go. And where are the protections? When do my little sisters get to say, I feel safe? I don't feel like they're safe, so I know they're not safe. And when I reach out to police officers, social workers, individuals who are supposed to stand up for them, those are the type of answers I get. We don't have enough resources. Your mother has housing, they have food, they're fine, but they're not. They're being traumatized every day. They don't know if their mother is going to OD while they're driving. My little sister is 8, and she has to make sure that my mother is woke at every green light to move on, and to drive. And those are things that I present to social workers and police officers, and they tell me that there's nothing that they can do. And I think that that is where the line should be drawn. Protections for young people. So this is where the career starts as a young person. Your mind is always thinking, okay, how can I help my mother? You don't see your mother as a addict. You see her as your mother, and you need to help her do what she needs to do to help to take care of you. And then you start to think, how can I do that? And the only resources you have is people, in the neighborhoods that you're redlined in and red zoned in, and different things that the government has put into place that we can only see certain avenues, but which is by design. So I say that to say, I think that it's very important for measures to be put into place from the starting point. People who are at the front and center, the police officers who come to those calls, and they need to have the resources. They need to have contacts with the Annie Casey Foundation. They need to have contacts with social workers who actually know what to do.
Yeah.
In these
And
cases.
And Nikita, first, both you and Crystal, that was so incredibly powerful. And I think, first, thank you for sharing and for being vulnerable in this space with us, and for educating the audience, for everyone that's participating on, the intersectionality of all of these issues. Because I think it's one of the things that oftentimes gets lost when we talk about kids in the justice system. And so I just thank you so much for grounding that and for being vulnerable with us. And I actually want to bring Nate actually into this conversation, because I think what you and Crystal have outlined is a really great framing for a lot of the work that the Annie Casey Foundation is doing and sort of trying to connect all of these dots. And so thank you. Take some time if you need. And Nate, I'm gonna bring you into this conversation, because I think what we just heard from both Crystal and Nikita was incredibly powerful. And I think that the Annie Casey Foundation has sort of been connecting these dots. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about what we just heard in terms of, the failures of the system in child welfare, in education, in juvenile justice, and how that then, relates to kids' involvement in the justice system and the broader failure, the systemic failure of vulnerable kids coming into the system. And if you can also tie into that, Nate, the work of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council and how everything we just heard relates to these issues. And is this something that is being taken into consideration by the council as it's looking at new laws that are recommendations for new laws?
Sure. So I'll try to do all that and not take too much time. I'll start by saying I don't know how I'm going to add more than what Nikita just said. That I think her personal experience says it all in some ways, but let me try to sort of back it out a little bit. I was thinking about this as you're saying that, like, there seems to be a few things when I think about the connections between these different systems and what are the themes that tie them together, based on what I was just hearing and also just on the experience. I think the first one is, and this relates, I think, to the report too, it's much too easy to get into these systems and it's too hard to get out. And when I think about things like even the age issue of setting a minimum age of jurisdiction in the juvenile justice system, or on the other end of things, extreme sentences and sort of release plans and what happens afterwards, all of that stuff. Sometimes even in well-meaning ways, the system is dragging in people who ought to have something else. And it's really hard then to get out on the other side in a way that makes people feel like there's a path to something better, opportunity, and the system becomes the thing. And I think a lot of our conversations right now in the Juvenile Justice Reform Council have been about that very point, about how long young people who are on juvenile probation, who are 14 years old, being on for 2 years on juvenile probation is just an enormous amount of your life. And for what purpose exactly? To what end exactly? What am I getting on the other end of it? So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that I really heard in what Nikita is saying, and I think this is one of the failures not only of the systems, but of even system reforms oftentimes, which is we're talking about cases instead of talking about people. We're talking about what do we do in reforming how we handle a case when there's children and families who are under that case number, under that court case that is moving through. And when I hear Nikita talking about what it's like to see children in pain, to see children who are having to step up for their parents, and to see the lack of response in a way that's giving people what they actually need, is jarring. And I think that is true across systems we fall back on this worst instinct, which is to get more technocratic with our responses so that we have a method and we have a framework and we have a methodology, and it leaves us in a place where we lose the humanity of the people who are suffering, both outside of the system and at the hands of the system. And I think connected with that then as a third thing is about equity. And we haven't talked much about it. But, it's just, I talk often about within juvenile justice, but it's the same thing. Like, we just simply operate in different worlds depending on race, depending on where people live, the neighborhood, the zip code. It's part of my response to saying, when I say I think people in Maryland would be shocked, the truth is it exposes my own experience and my own privilege of my life, that I'm saying people would be shocked, because I'm saying people who don't experience this day to day, who haven't been connected to the justice system, who aren't involved in the child welfare system, who have their kids in a good public school that's doing well by their kids, would be shocked. That's what I meant. And I said it without even qualifying it that way, because that's my experience and that's my exposure. So that's my third thing. And I think all those things in common suggest we need to listen to people, we need to listen to Nikita. We need to take her advice. We need to listen to young people who are experiencing the justice system and their ideas and what it is that they're aspiring to do. What is it that they are asking for? And when they're seeking help, it's our job to provide it. So connecting it, and I said I'd go short and now I'm going long, so I apologize, but connecting it to the Reform Council, like a couple things. One is there are some specific things in the report that I think the Reform Council will be addressing, and they're challenging, I'll just be honest, in a context of lots of different people with roles and opinions, and they have to do with some of that legal framework around age. The minimum age of jurisdiction of the system is one of the things that we've already had debate about. We're going to, I think, have a new vote on the topic, but it's one that's has had some promise. I think I would expect we will leave this council with establishing having voted on a minimum age that is higher than that 10 that you set. I'm not optimistic about everything. I'm optimistic about that. I think what you said, James, in laying out the issue about 14-year-olds and being tried as adults, and saying we don't give points when there's exceptions. I think at its core, one of the struggles of this of the council and of this conversation is that we have a field that has suggested that it is listening to the adolescent brain research and focused on the adolescent brain research. And I think that we are willing to throw all of it out the window once a young person is accused of a very serious crime. All of that stuff we decide doesn't matter, that we can accept children are children and adolescence is a unique period of time. But when a young person picks up a gun and shoots somebody, then we decide all of a sudden that all that stuff about impulsivity and all that stuff about the brain that's still developing and all of that stuff goes out the window. And I think that that's a real challenge, I think, with the council, frankly, of as we talk about of the other end of the system and how are we setting policies that don't make it so easy in Maryland to try children as adults. That is another issue that we're talking about there. So I think we are addressing these things. They are coming up, and I think as the report shows, they are more challenging, and from where I sit, than they should be, of getting consensus of the need to set these basic standards for legal protection for kids.
Thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate your grounding that and framing it. And I'm going to bring our good friend Emily in, our resident conservative. I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to sort of package them together because I think Nate brought up some really interesting points. And I think it's interesting, right? Because Maryland culturally and politically is struggling with this, but it doesn't seem to be the case that there are conservatives, you know, in some of the states I mentioned, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, where, you know, the idea of not trying a child under the age of 14 as an adult, not even controversial, right? Setting a minimum age of at least 10 for juvenile court jurisdiction, not even controversial. Banning life without parole in states like North Dakota and Arkansas, you know, it's somewhat controversial, but overwhelmingly supported by the conservative majorities, super majorities in those states, right? And so, Emily, I wanted to ask you, just from the standpoint of, you know, people who come from a conservative background, from a value ethic, what do you think it is that has allowed for conservatives in other jurisdictions to really kind of embrace these reforms from an ideological perspective, or maybe from a values perspective, whether it's faith, family, whatever that might be? And so I want you to sort of big picture answer that question. Then also, you wrote a really amazing white paper that I wanted to shout out last year about how Maryland allows children to be transferred into the adult system. And so I wanted to give you the platform to talk a little bit about that and what kind of reforms could come about if Maryland really embraced what you highlighted, because it would address a lot of these issues that we've also talked about in the report as well.
Thank you, James, for that setup. I think the fundamental thing that brings conservatives and Democrats to the table is thinking about the impact on the young person and public safety. And particularly thinking through, is incarcerating a young person actually better? Is that truly going to make a positive difference in their lives? I personally believe there are limited chances. There are limited sort of cases where removing that young person from the community might be best for them, and it might be best for the public. But of course, you know, we can have a longer conversation about the types of services that need to be provided for that to be the case. And same with the adult system, even more limited. You know, there are truly very exceptional cases where I think that would be appropriate, but and always should be an individualized determination. But for the most part, we know that the youth system was founded on the goals of rehabilitation. That's not that is why we created a different juvenile court system for young people, and that also the juvenile system, it is taking, hopefully, and if it's doing its job rightly, is taking into account what it means to be a young person, what it means to be developmentally growing, to be impulsive, to be a little bit more risk loving, and is helping shape and develop that young person into a productive adults. So I think at the basic level, conservatives are brought to the table when they are given the data and evidence, or pushed to consider that evidence around public safety. Is this actually better for the young person, for the, if there's a victim or survivor of crime related to their offense, are we actually better off by thinking through this? And what the evidence shows us is often we're not. Is often that actually incarcerating a young person, bringing them into the adult system is much worse for that young person. Somewhat similar because of what Nikita just mentioned, because they're not, they're still coming back to that same community, that same lack of support, in some cases even more distance from those productive relationships that are trying to support them, trying to get them the help they need. So I would say that public safety, that young person's health and well-being, but also there's an argument for fiscal responsibility. And I think, conservatives are somewhat often the first people at the table to say, hey, incarceration is not cheap. And we saw the Texas, in the adult criminal justice system, that Texas's budget, crisis, when they were thinking about building another couple of prisons. That's what really led to this whole conservative slew of criminal justice reform, both in the youth and adult system, thinking through, hey, our budget's kind of strapped. We say we're going to be fiscally responsible. We're not helping these young people. We're not helping these adults. We need to rethink through our priorities. Why are we doing this? There's this false notion of safety when you remove someone away, when you push the problem away, but you're only pushing that problem away for a year or two, right? And a lot of times you're making it worse. And so I think public safety, fiscal responsibility, thinking about the young person is what brings conservatives to the table. But the other thing, and I think that's perhaps been a little bit more difficult for folks in Maryland, is proximity to the problem. People, representatives and local leaders that are listening to their community, that are seeing, crime occur, that are seeing also the interventions maybe work, maybe not, or seeing really innovative interventions like Baltimore's Joins program that are trying to get young people connected to services earlier. They're internalizing that problem a little bit more similar to, maybe what Nate and I feel, which is the communities that maybe don't have that same problem with crime, or they view the crime problem as, a Baltimore City problem, a Baltimore County problem. And so they don't have that same impetus, that same proximity, maybe to consider what does this mean? Because young people in their community are still affected by state laws, even if the number of young people affected is a little bit smaller. What does that mean to my community, and how is that playing out? And I think it's in some other states, particularly when you have, Republican majorities in legislatures, right? That proximity is a little bit more evenly spread politically. But no, whether Republican or Democrat, a religious individual or not, there is that basic American tenet and believing in individual responsibility and in human dignity and liberty that really needs to be brought back into this debate. I think there's appetite for that, but a lot of the questions, and which is where I'll transition to the next question, a lot of it comes down to, in Maryland, I think a kind of a struggle to understand, is this actually good for public safety? And in this discourse between short-term kind of results, as in that short-term incapacitation effect of removing that young person from the community that feels safer, is perceived to be safer for the community, and this a little bit a doubt of the fact that we can actually serve young people in the community effectively, or that we can serve them in the youth justice system as opposed to the adult system effectively, which frankly is not in line what we see in the research, or what we see even from Maryland's own data, but really has been a hurdle in the past in getting bipartisan support in Maryland. But I'm hoping that, as there's more education, as the Juvenile Justice Reform Council and other groups, start talking about these issues, as people gain more knowledge, hear stories like, Nikita's, that they'll start to internalize and really think through, the true benefits and costs, both in human lives, and in fiscal dollars of what's happening. And yeah, one of the things we mentioned in the report, and so in the latest data from the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention is from 2019, and in 2019 we saw 949 kids charged as adults. So that is almost 1,000 children who are having their lives changed. Now, the good thing is Maryland, they have provisions which allow for those young people, charged adults, to be transferred back to the youth system in certain cases, not in every case. But again, that's still a lengthy process, even if they are, I think in fiscal year, sorry, that was calendar year 2019 for the first statistic. In fiscal year, 2019, we saw around 330 youth transferred back. So that's good, that's beneficial, but there's still a lot of youth who are stuck in the adult system. There's still the problem of having your, when you're criminally charged an adult, you don't have the same protections for privacy. You still have that adult arrest record. There are, your name is out there, and the details of your offense, your alleged offense are out there, and that is permanently harmful for young people. And then for the kids that are in the adult system, there's really no evidence that the adult system is doing any better for them. It certainly has a whole different mission, again, than the youth system. And Garrett pointed out that there was a legal change a couple years back that now most youth charged as adults are able to be held in juvenile detention facilities rather than the adult system. So there is some differences there, but they're still, if they're tried and incarcerated as an adult, they're eventually still going to be transferred to the adult system at age 18. And so they're missing out on those couple years of juvenile services that youth who are transferred back are able to receive. And most of the time, I mean, when you look at who is charged as an adult, it's because of the state statute. It's because they're categories of offenses which automatically exclude individuals from juvenile court jurisdiction, meaning that they're automatically tried as an adult or charged as an adult. It's not because a judge made a determination, heard the case, understood the history of the young person, understood the context, and decided that the youth system was not the best avenue to hear their case. Again, those are if Maryland really wants to have a system grounded in evidence, grounded in doing the best for children, grounded in doing the best for communities, then we need to give judges a space to make that determination in those most serious offenses, not in every offense, most serious offenses, and not have this system where instead we automatically say, no, we're gonna write that kid off to the adult system. So there's a lot of areas for reform. I think one of the things that your report did that was really great was, again, highlight that all youth should start in the youth system. I don't want to give a percentage, but 99%, if I'm throwing one out there, should stay in the youth system. And that Maryland needs to think through again about making sure that if there is any decision to transfer a youth into the adult system, that there's a judicial determination that that child has their due process rights, that they're given care appropriate to their needs, and that really we're doing well by that young person, we're doing well by the community, and we're doing well for the victim of their crime, that we're saying that we care enough about this crime to make sure that they actually don't commit a crime again, which is by making sure you address those underlying issues.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. Just to highlight a couple of things that you said, the number of youth charged in the adult system who don't get transferred back, right? Then they face the exact same mandatory minimum sentences that an adult would, no matter what their age, no matter what their diminished culpability, the circumstances, right? And so to sort of see how all of that kind of fits together when kids are tried in the adult system, and then how the mandatory minimum issue impacts them is an important one. The other thing that you said that was really powerful, I thought, was the issue of proximity. I've had the privilege of working all across the country with Democrats and Republicans. I've maybe never seen two states with legislators more active in going into the prison system than in the states of North Dakota and Utah, actually. The Mormon missionaries there, and many of the folks in the legislature are practicing Mormons, make it a priority to go into youth facilities and into adult prisons and to actually conduct ministry and to be proximate with folks. And so I think that's another reason why you see sort of, this focus on rehabilitation and redemption and understanding that we're all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And maybe that's a good segue into our good friend Garrett from the Catholic Conference. A few years ago, actually, the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth led an effort to get a number of letters from juvenile lifers here in the United States to Pope Francis, And then he wrote a letter back to them, which was really powerful. And so the Catholic Church has been really engaged on this issue for some time. And Garrett, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. And I have a sort of a couple of questions for you in this way. One is, people always tend to forget sometimes when you're having this conversation and people start talking about faith, but I always like to point out that, Moses, King David, the Apostle Paul, for folks who are, either Jewish or of Christian faith, all were guilty of murder, right? They all killed people in the Bible, and yet they're significant figures in both of those religious texts. And most faiths, right, regardless of your religious background, most faiths embrace this idea of redemption and reconciliation. And so I was wondering, Garrett, can you talk a little bit about how the Catholic Conference uses these lessons to educate public policymakers on the need specifically for criminal justice reform? And then can you also talk about how the advocacy community in general can do a better job of engaging people of faith to prioritize these issues?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just to answer your first question regarding Moses, David, Apostle Paul, these are folks, and this is something that I gradually realized over the years. There's so many people in Scripture that are factual historical figures, men and women who were leaders that had done terrible things, and they were really redeemed and went on to lead and do great things. So I think to answer your question, we try to reinforce the same message with regard to our youth in the justice system. Redemption from past mistakes isn't conceptual, it's factual. So our policies really need to acknowledge and reflect that, and that's something that we believe. But when people are held down by their circumstances through systems of justice that are promulgated by the rest of society, if you will, through laws and policies, we're cutting them off from that possibility of being an impactful citizen or even eventually an impactful leader in the future. So many are lost to the system. And that's a concern we'd like to really address. I think your question, James, your second question was about the faith community and how we can engage people, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, and I really want to thank Emily for bringing some of the, sort of specific examples of things we're talking about here to the table. Just to frame before I answer that question, I just want to state that things we've supported in recent years have been, in Maryland specifically, diversion and informal adjustment, youth being charged as adults, bans on solitary confinement, bans on youth being held in adult jail, policies that promote educational continuity for system-involved youth, and especially a life without parole, a ban on life without parole. So, and I think some of the core tenets of our beliefs demand that we support those efforts. And I'll tell you, where we're coming from. We're coming on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. Bishop's statement that is entitled Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic Perspective on Crime and Criminal Justice. So it's a wonderful document. It really describes the church's position specifically on criminal justice reform. But like Emily was talking about too, if I had to break those statements like that down, our role is to be a voice regarding two principles, which is the inherent dignity of every human person, and then, like she was saying, a rehabilitation or redemption as sort of the centerpiece of any system of justice. That's one of our key tenets. So very simply put, we don't want to put people, we don't want to throw people away when they violate the common good. We should address the situation. We should foster healing. We should promote redemption. But I think what makes this issue very compelling for the faith leaders and the faith community, particularly the Catholic Church, is that our U.S. courts have even agreed with some of the basic tenets of what I just described. So our courts have acknowledged key elements of rehabilitation, and that people have the capability to turn their lives around, and that they should be afforded those chances. So, and it was a principle that was acknowledged last week in oral arguments at the Supreme Court in a case regarding juvenile life without parole, which will hopefully build upon Justice Kagan's opinion in Miller v. Alabama, as we're also familiar with. So to answer the question of how I believe we can engage, engaging folks, especially in the faith community, is really a matter of legislative advocacy, but it's also a matter of education. So, there's over 1 million Catholics in Maryland alone, and we've got people on both sides of the aisle. So we've got legislators on both sides of the aisle too as well, and that's important to note. And we all share the same faith. So I think that education is about recognizing those differing paradigms from within very large faith communities and recognizing what's at the core of our beliefs and to go from there. So the last thing I just want to note too, if I may, is that we have these discussions of Democrat and Republican, we have these discussions of right and left, and we looked to, parent reform policy progress made in states like West Virginia and Arkansas. And in building upon what Nate was saying previously about his personal experience and my personal experience, I'd like to question really the demographical differences between those states. I think that's something that we have to recognize when we're discussing reform, and question why Maryland hasn't made the same progress. Maybe I'm ignorant. I admit to what I perceive as demographics in those states, but I think that we need to do better for our minority communities too, impacted by the current policies.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Garrett. And I'm going to bring everyone back into the conversation with just a general question before I give folks the final word and we wrap up here. But kind of building off of the engagement of the faith community, we're going to have a lot of folks who are listening into this conversation. It's been incredibly powerful. All of you have just been so brilliant, and it's really been an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with all of you. But I wanted to ask each of you if you could talk a little bit about ways that folks who are listening in might be able to get engaged in some of the work. And in the words of the late, great Congressman John Lewis, help get into some good trouble and make a positive change in the state of Maryland. So do folks have suggestions for folks who might be listening who want to be engaged, want to be active citizens, but don't know how, what they might be able to do, both in terms of supporting each of your organizations, as well as the broader movement to change the way that children are treated in the justice system? Don't all jump at once.
Here, I'll jump in, James. I think at a basic level, reach out to people in your community and listen for where there are issues, listen and support them, personally as you can, but also then take those issues and advocate on behalf of them to your legislators. It's so much, easier to do some of this education and advocacy. A lot of times, it's us, we can show up with stats and data, but it's those personal stories. It's saying how you've been impacted, how members of your community have been impacted. And, for those of us who maybe are in positions of privilege, we have a little bit of greater access to that. I think it's our part of our responsibility too, to use that well. And so I think reaching out to your legislators, even, you don't have to, be in Baltimore City or Baltimore County to think that this is an important issue that Maryland should work on, right? Even if it's not impacting your children, it is impacting children in your state. And so I think that would be my encouragement, is not to, relegate advocacy, to folks that are really dealing with some of the biggest outcomes of this government overreach in these areas. And yet at the same time government underperformance, but that we would all really internalize this as an issue that we should care about.
I want to say that I think if people want to get active right now in the state of Maryland for juvenile life without parole, Delegate Jazz Lewis is putting forward legislation this upcoming session called the Juvenile Restoration Act, and we need as much support as we can to have people reach out to their delegates, reach out to their senators, and tell them why they should be supporting this legislation. The legislation accomplishes a few things, including abolishing the sentence of juvenile life without parole, is permitting a person who was convicted of a crime committed while they were a minor to file a motion for a sentence reduction, and they'll go through a judicial hearing. The court can then reduce their sentence if they've been in prison over 20 years. It's not a danger to the public, and the interests of justice are served by the sentence reduction. It also requires the court to really look at these youth characteristics that Nikita talked about, look at their circumstances when they're moving forward towards sentencing, which is we see is very crucial, because at that point, the hope is that they'll be able to more than likely divert them to the resources that they need, even while they're serving their sentences, or even hopefully outside of the adult court. So I think those are three critical things that we hope happen moving forward. And we're hoping that many people will reach out to their legislators and say, I want to support the Juvenile Restoration Act. You definitely can, for more information, we do a lot of things. We have groups. We're featured in the Washington Post recently for a support group we do for juvenile lifers bi-weekly. So we have a lot of supports here that we've been having, and we're hoping that people can give us more in-kind donations to help our efforts. You can visit our website at www.cfsy.org. Short, quick, easy to the point, and find out more information that I can give during this short presentation. But thank you all.
And I want to piggyback on what you just shared. I think it's important for individuals from any walk of life to have conversations with your children. Have conversations with your children, because they're going to be able to have intimate conversations with other youth who may be going through certain situations that they don't feel safe enough to speak to an adult about. And they may be able to share, an opportunity. Your children may be able to share an opportunity, a something that they learned from you that could give that young person the courage or the knowledge to speak up and speak out about what they're going through. I think that everybody needs to share their stories in creative ways on social media. And you can, for example, also get involved with the People's Commission. We're also going to legislation and trying to get status offenses taken off the table. And we're also backing the stopping young people from being charged as adults. Go to Decriminalize.org to find out more. And for young people, I want young people to get involved more, because this involves us. It's about us. It's about where we're going to be, where we're going to go in the future. And if we don't have the supports that we need, it's going to affect everyone, because we are the future. Economically, if all young people are incarcerated or on probation or not able to be functioning societal members or citizens, how is this country gonna run? And economically, everybody's gonna lose. So that's what I want to share.
Anybody else?
If I could add, I think that we often have these discussions about what can we do next, what are our next steps. I think what we're doing right here is a good example that other folks can do. We have folks on this panel just from all walks of life and different experiences, and I really commend Nikita for sharing and being vulnerable and sharing your personal experiences too, as well. And I think we all bring a different perspective. So I'd encourage other people to do the same thing. Get together with people or bring them to your legislators, if you will, and talk about your different shared experiences, because I think that the communication is probably the key. I think we have a sort of a breakdown of human face-to-face understanding in our society sometimes these days. And I think if that compassion from hearing people's different paradigms and different experiences comes together, and we can foster understanding and make change from there, I think that's really important. So I encourage other people to do exactly what you, and especially I thank everybody for facilitating this conversation. What we're doing here is huge. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Garrett. And Emily or Nate, do you guys have any last sage wise words of wisdom to share?
Feel free to take it away.
I'm good. I don't think I'm going to say it better than what was just said. So I appreciate those comments, and I'm happy to leave it there. That was great.
Great, Emily. All right. Well, thank you. Just let me thank you all so much. I'm going to pass it back to Ashley now, but this has been an incredibly powerful conversation. I just want to thank all of you for participating, for being vulnerable in this space, for lending your time and your expertise. And, you know, one last thing that I will say for folks, you know, this report is a really powerful tool. We developed it specifically to hold policymakers accountable and really inspire people to want to change the way that their systems treat children. And so one of the things that folks can do, take the report, send it to your local state legislator, and say, hey, you know, Maryland's one of the worst states. We need to be in our tier 1 state. We need to be protecting the human rights of our children in a much better way than we currently are. You know, please make reforms to make this, pass reforms to make this possible. So that's one really powerful example of the way folks can engage with this report as well. Thank you all so very much for your time. And Ashley, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us for World Children's Day. My name is Ashley Devon, and I'm the Youth Justice Policy Director at Advocates for Children and Youth. I want to take a moment and recognize our two major partners on this panel, on this virtual event. The Maryland Youth Justice Coalition. I want to thank all the members of MyJC that are present, and I want to share a little bit about MyJC. MyJC is a group of passionate advocates that and policy experts dedicated to creating a more fair and equitable youth criminal legal system, where not only youth are given opportunities and options, but public safety is uplifted. MyJC aims to improve the lives of all system-involved youth through legislative and policy advocacy. MyJC is made up of organizations including representation from directly impacted and youthful individuals. We share our equitable vision for the future of the youth in the criminal legal system, and we are dedicated to supporting evidence-based, culturally competent, and gender-responsive solutions that are vetted by directly impacted individuals and promote positive youth development and public safety. I want to also end this by sending a humongous thank you to the People's Commission. The People's Commission was established for the purpose to reduce desperate impacts of the justice system on youth and adults who have historically been targeted and marginalized by local and state criminal and juvenile laws based on their race, gender, disability, and socioeconomic status. The core of the work of this commission is to examine Maryland's legal codes to understand ways in which Maryland's criminal laws reinforce structural racism and inequality. The commission's initial findings will be presented in a public report this legislative session. And so if you are interested in standing up or standing with us, we cannot do change without you. Many of the panelists have talked about ways in which you can get involved, but I want to quickly go over 3 ways in which you can get engaged in this work. If you want to advocate for the human rights of kids, please write your Maryland delegate and senator to urge them to pass reforms for our 2020 legislative agenda. Join us. Please feel free to join the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition or the People's Commission. And if you love the work that you saw displayed and described here today, please support the organizations doing the work. I want to do a final humongous thank you to James Dole and your continued advocacy for the human rights for kids throughout the United States. And I want to thank each one of our panelists for giving up your morning to come for such a critical conversation. In some ways, I was like, oh, I wish I could be on the panel. And then Nikita and Crystal spoke, and I just was in tears. And it was just really powerful. Thank you for the experts. Thank you for our faith-based community partners. Thank you for our youth and our former system involved folks. And thank you for everyone in Maryland who wants to advocate on behalf of children. This is our show, and happy World Children's Day.